and welcome to Listen and Be Heard.
Giving it.
My name is Martha Senator, and we have a very special show for you today. Please stay tuned.
Taking it. Moving it around.
I'm joined live in the studio by Meredith Leigh and Laura Lengnick, and we're bringing you a special 2-hour program today. That because I had Laura here before, and 20 minutes was just not enough to talk about resilient agriculture. So Laura is the author of Resilient Agriculture. She's an award-winning soil scientist with 30 years of experience working as a researcher, policymaker, educator, activist, and farmer to put sustainability values into action in U.S. food and farming. Her research in soil health and sustainable farming systems was nationally recognized with the USDA Secretary's Honor Award in 2002, and she served as a lead author of the 2013 USDA report, Climate Change and Agriculture in the United States, Effects and Adaptation. Laura is founder and owner of Cultivating Resilience, a private firm that works with organizations of all kinds to integrate resilience thinking into operations and strategic planning. And Meredith Leigh, over the past 15 years, has worked as a farmer, chef, teacher, nonprofit executive director, and writer, all in pursuit of sustainable food. She has developed a farmers cooperative, catalyzed nonprofit farm ventures, raised flowers, vegetables, and pastured meats, owned and managed a retail butcher shop, and more. She's a mother to 4 children, many plants, and numerous fermentation projects. That from her book, Pure Charcuterie, The Craft and Poetry of Curing Meats at Home, and her previous publication called The Ethical Meat Handbook. Both of these books are the reason why Laura has invited Meredith to join us here today. That and because Meredith was the editor for her new edition of Resilient Agriculture. So we are going to talk about the many things that can be done to affect climate change in a more positive way instead of continuing on in the vein that we've been going. And we're going to talk about that process of writing the book. But the book starts with a poem, and a poem is a great way to start a show that talks about solutions and creativity. So we're going to start that way. Just give me a moment. Dandelion by Digger. There is a lot to learn in this moment from those who some call weeds, like the settler who names another invader, and the dandelion who with the utmost humility quietly defies the hubris of the plowman, repairing with tap roots the hardened ground, and sharing in abundance their nectar, their pollen and seeds with the world. Pay attention to them, young blood, and how they not only survive, but thrive through moments of change. Laura and Meredith, welcome to Listen and Be Heard. I'm very happy to have you here.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for joining me. as I was saying, the previous 20 minutes we had to speak, Laura, was just not enough. We were talking about not wasting food, which is a pretty simple thing. But you came to, this was actually a second edition, a new edition of Resilient Agriculture. And we wanted to talk about the process that you and Meredith went through and how you found your voice writing this book.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So yes, this was a second edition, and I got started on the second edition. I will never forget the publisher, the editor of my publisher, New Society, called to say, hey, we're running out of the first edition. Would you like to write a second edition or like us to print a second edition? And we'll make a few changes and go ahead and print it. And
how many years was that?
Maybe 4 since the first edition. And I was a little concerned about that only because climate change science and also the climate is changing so quickly that I wondered about and basically told him in that conversation that, well, I'll probably need to update the climate science. And he said, fine, but whatever you do, don't write a new book.
And you wrote a new book.
And I wrote a new book. But in my defense, that conversation with the editor happened, with New Society editor, happened in December or November of 2019, and all of us know what happened in February of 2020. And so, my world certainly shifted, as did many other folks. And as I was working away on the second edition, and just started to feel very strongly that I couldn't just make some simple changes to this and call it a second edition.
Why?
So much of what was going on in the world in, let's say, the spring of 2020 was influenced or was related to resilience. And particularly, if folks can remember back on that time, early on in the pandemic in the U.S., there were some real concerns about the having a continuous food supply. And many Americans, those that have the money they need to shop every week, many of them for the first time encountered empty shelves.
Money or no money.
Money or no money, that's right. And I think, and that really, from where I stood in the pandemic, that really caused some folks to step back and think about the food system, how they're fed, who feeds them, and the kinds of effects that were being felt all through the food system during the early days of the pandemic. From my perspective, the global food system, which has been promoted to us as a secure way to maintain a good supply of diverse foods all through the year, and a very reliable supply of food, shuttered. It shuttered for the first time in my life experience as well. And I think this, and it also, in that shuttering or in that shaking of the food system in the early days of the pandemic, I think a lot of truths also emerged. There was light shone on a system that has many, many negative benefits, many important effects on the people who feed us, and many unfortunate effects on the people who feed us. And I think that in that time, it was a very special time for me as someone who's interested in foodways and interested in transforming the way we eat within the context of climate change. It was a way it was a time in which I got a richer idea about the kinds of changes that needed to be made. Mm-hmm. And I just couldn't make a few changes to this book.
So enter Meredith.
Yes, so enter Meredith.
And how did this seem to you when, I guess, Laura came to you with this? What were your first thoughts about how she should approach doing this revision?
Oh, well, I guess... Can you hear me okay?
Now we can.
Okay,
Sorry.
Perfect, yeah. So that's a really interesting question because I'm a writer myself and had written my own books and was very much in the food resilience world, just in a very niche way through the meat supply, which we know COVID was massively exposing of the brokenness of the meat supply chain. But I've always been a reader of other people's work and kind of a helper to other writers. But Laura really came and was like, I want to formalize your role as an editor. She kind of helped me shape myself as an editor, which I think is there's a bit of a call and response in this story because she was like, you know the food system so well, and also your writing is so impactful, and I need help with making this more broadly applicable. And I don't even know what you call that in editing, but let's figure it out and let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah. And so
it's a combination, though, of you having already intimate knowledge of the food system.
Yes.
And Laura, it's interesting to me, actually, I hadn't thought about it, but you were studying climate change, but COVID somehow brought into focus for you something about the food system.
About resilience of the food system in a completely new way.
Right.
And maybe even a different readiness on the behalf of readers for receiving the information than when you originally wrote the book, I'm assuming.
Even just in the space of 4 years.
Right. So. Yeah. And I think, Laura and I go pretty far back. I was one of Laura's students at Warren Wilson College when she first came to Warren Wilson College. And I think at first we were like, who is this lady? We didn't really see eye to eye. But I think one of the reasons for that is because we do have a different way of thinking. Sometimes we'll be saying the same thing, and then it takes us a couple conversations to realize
to understand
that we are saying the same thing. But I think that plays really well in editing and writing because what she needed was somebody who could put a different pitch or help her put a different pitch, let's say, on the same ideas and make them more broadly communicable, right? And her training is as an academic writer, a scientific writer. So how could more voice
go from
be
convincing your colleagues of an argument to a more broader type of conversation?
Yeah, the way I began to think about it, or what I wanted to do when I reached out to Meredith, was to figure out a way to invite people into the story, invite the reader into the story.
And that's crucially important, isn't it? I mean, I think, a lot of scientists are already pretty convinced of, or maybe the information is out there, let's say, the research is out there for climate change and even, and we'll get deeper into this, the foodways and so on. But it's not necessarily in the public consciousness, right? Mm-hmm. In the sense that I think climate change is, but not necessarily, and this is why I felt it was so important for us all to talk today, not necessarily the solutions or the ways we can participate in those solutions.
Yeah, and I think there's also something about science that just doesn't get at the way it all feels. Mm-hmm. And we see that people are taking facts, very true, very, very stark facts, and going, I can't deal with this, and so I'm even willing to accept something that's untrue because I can't deal with this. So it doesn't matter almost in this day and age how much information you throw at people if you don't get at the essence or the feeling or the connectivity it has to their human experience, and also show a little bit of humanity as a writer, then I don't know how impactful that we can really be. And I think that one thing you achieved in the second edition of your book is you bring in that story and you bring in yourself in the way that science writing doesn't do. And you bring in some of the spiritual aspects of doing this work and some of the deep ancestral aspects of doing this work that I think are really seen as like outside of science. And we need more blending of that with science. So this book does a lot of things, for sure.
Was that difficult, Laura? Was it difficult to go from saying these are the facts to what Meredith described a little earlier as this is what I think about the facts?
Massive, massive struggle. I knew I needed to add some kind of personal story in the book. So massive because when you're taught to be an academic or a scientific writer, or at least in the time I was taught to do it, which is 30 years ago, there was a premium placed on keeping yourself out of the story. In fact, that was important, to keep yourself out of the story and maintain this illusion of objectivity.
Which is an illusion.
Total illusion.
It is an illusion, yeah. Yeah, and that's like a whole nother segment that we
won't
could
even
talk
get
about.
into all that. Yeah.
Yeah, I wondered if this might come up today, and so I just do want to say for all you scientists out there that I think that there is such a thing as proper scientific method,
yes,
performed with integrity. So I'm not saying that all scientists are liars.
And I wasn't trying to knock science.
Okay.
No,
all right.
No, but the idea that we don't affect or have some kind of prejudices or preconceived notions is something we always have to think about. Right?
That's right. That's right. And for me, the way I would say that is that everyone brings a perspective to their work, including scientists, and we'll just leave that.
So how did you get this out of her, though?
Yeah.
Meredith? What was the process there?
Well, let me set up Meredith just a little bit, and then I'll let her tell you. One thing that I knew after the first edition and after the book tour from the first edition was one thing that really surprised me in that experience. Remember, coming to this as an academic scientist, was the questions people asked me were about me. So I'd give a talk. I'd be ready to answer all sorts of scientific questions about climate change or how we adapt or the farmers. I tell there are a lot of farmer stories. People wanted to know about me, how I was feeling, how I got into this, why I got into this. And that really surprised me. And I think that is the best example I can give for how far I needed to go.
I see.
As a writer.
I think that goes back to the objectivity thing, because I think what people long for with a quote-unquote objective knowledge is like, how do I interact with this? Like, I don't...
How do I use it?
No, and the one person who's the authority on it is like not giving me the synergy that I need to witness in order to understand, like, how does this come alive? And so I think, like, we're about to talk about holistic thinking, systems thinking, resilience, like things not being reductionist or pieces and parts. And so I think similarly, like, I look at a book as an organism, like there's a heart to the story, there's bones to the story, there's like, it's a metaphor for like an organism. And so going to someone's work and going to Laura's work, like I can see when she comes alive in the writing, And so what we did was she sent me initially a piece of it, or the whole thing?
Or maybe pieces as I was working on them.
And I had read the book before, because like she was my mentor and my professor. Right. Like when the first book came out, I bought it and I read it, but I went back to it and I said, and you had written a new introduction, I think.
That's
was,
right.
Yeah, a little bit about your story.
It was my story, yeah.
Yep. Which I think you should maybe tell. But like, I could just see like this huge juxtaposition between like what was informational and original to the book and then what was like kind of just like the little firefly in like the deep cavern of Laura that was like still trying to get out like in the air, you know? And so I just was like, this part, this is where your voice comes through, or here's where we really need to know what you think as the authority.
And so she was able to amplify a bit those areas.
And also not being afraid to be like radical about some things that we were just at this point in the food system, like we need to be radical about.
We need to be radical, right?
Exactly.
Yes.
And so saying like, yep, you get to have an opinion here, and it's okay if it's uncomfortable for people, you know, I think was really important in the process.
Well, what I found compelling in reading the book was how you came to the conclusion that you needed to write this book. That you were asked to do this study led you to the realization that you were the person who had to write the book. How did that... Can you talk about that for a moment? Because to me, that was made me want to say, well, thank you. Thank you for writing the book.
Totally.
Because obviously you were the person. It's not like anybody could have written this book. You had the knowledge and the background to do it. And you similarly came to that conclusion. Mm-hmm. Is that how you thought, Meredith? I mean, what did you think about just the... about like Laura's position as the person who would give this message?
Yeah, I mean, totally. She has a unique perspective on it and a background, I think, that's very trustable. And I think those two things coming together make it perfect. But will you tell that story about the original assignment and like the aha moment in your office?
Yes. Please.
Sure. I don't know about the aha moment.
Okay.
I think those might be two different.
Oh, okay.
Those
Sorry.
two different things.
Maybe so.
Things.
It was like a phone call.
It was a phone call.
Okay, thank you.
It was a phone call that utterly, when I look back on it, utterly disrupted my life. I had my life all planned, and I was going to go quietly into the sunset as a beloved professor at Warren Wilson College. And
sounds like a nice song.
Not bad. Not
Good
bad.
poem.
Yeah, and got a phone call. Completely unexpected in the middle of an afternoon in which nothing important was happening, and I was invited to speak on how climate change would change our food system here in Western North Carolina. And I said yes, because that's what you do when you're faculty at a small college and someone asks you to do a public speech. And so, I'll never forget it. The moment I'll never forget, that's the aha I think you're talking about, Meredith, is I put the phone down, and in that little bit of silence right after the phone call, I thought, I guess I'm going to have to learn something about climate change. And the rest is history. And it's not that
you really hadn't given it that much thought how it would affect the food supply.
Yes, I think it's fair to say I taught global warming. You know, at the time, I think I was a fairly typical undergraduate faculty member teaching about Earth systems and environmental studies. But I really had not put together how the climate had already changed. Mm-hmm. And particularly, for me anyway, as a scientist, I was fascinated by the subtle changes that were happening, the subtle weather changes, a little bit warmer nights, a little bit warmer, a little bit drier, more drier periods, these subtle changes, not the things we were reading about back then, which, by the way, was 2008. Uh-huh. I was so fascinated when I realized that there are all these little disturbances in our weather patterns and our seasonal patterns, and how sensitive plants and livestock are to these changes.
Right.
That piqued my scientific interest. And
I think in the last program we talked about that being kind of like the canary in the coal mine, but now we're like in the hottest week on record on Earth, right?
Yeah.
So we've kind of gotten past that point, I think, of looking for, not that those signs aren't still there, but we all really do need to really see and not continue to, as you were saying, to just try to pretend like it's not happening.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so just to try to answer Meredith's question, so there's the aha moment story, but I ended up, so that moment, went on, did that talk, learned a lot. It disturbed me, what I learned, and I just couldn't not change what I was doing as a result of it. And I think really that was probably the first sort of spiritual impulse that I had as a scientist to start working on something. And eventually was very lucky and got an opportunity to work on the national report that you mentioned in my bio. And it was actually in that work I had another aha, which was that at the time, and this was now 2012, there were no reports, no scientists were talking to farmers about the changes they were seeing. And this seemed crazy to me, because farmers and other folk that work with natural resources are at the front lines.
And we're all depending on them.
And so that's really the beginning of the book. I just began on my own, nights and weekends, calling farmers and finding farmers around the country, farmers and ranchers around the country that were willing to share their stories with me. Yeah.
Well, we are going to go on to talk about some of the ways that people can get involved and what you and I and people listening can do to have an effect on climate change. My guests here are Laura Lengnick and Meredith Leigh. You're listening to WPVM 103.7, the voice of Asheville. We're going to listen to a little poetry from Sonia Sanchez, and we will be right back.
Chairperson of the board is not digging for roots in the shadows. There's no dying of hunger stare in eyes of Chief Executive Officer of Petroleum. Somebody else is sinking into spring freeze of the soil. Somebody else is evaporating in dry winds of the famine. There's no severe drought in mouth of Senior Vice President of Funding Services. No military contractor is sitting in heat of a disappearing lake. No river is drying up in kidneys of a Minister of Defense. Secretary of Interior is not writing distress signals on toilet walls. Do you see a refugee camp cooped up in head of Vice President of Municipal Bonds? There's no food shortage in belly of a Minister of Agriculture. Chief Economic Advisors are addicted to diet pills. Banking committee members are suffering from obesity. Somebody else is sucking on dehydrated nipples. Somebody else is filling up on fly specks. The bishops are not forcing themselves to eat bark. The Security Exchange Commission members are sick from too many chocolate chip cookies. The Treasury Secretary is not going around in circles looking for grain. There's no desert growing in nose of Supreme Commander of Justice. It's somebody else without weight. Somebody else without blood. Somebody else without land. Somebody else without a cloud cover or water on the face. It's somebody else, always somebody else. into spring freeze of the soil. Somebody else is evaporating in dry wind of the famine. Somebody else is sucking on dehydrated nipples. Somebody else is filling up on fly specks. Somebody else is without weight. Somebody else without blood. Somebody else without land. Somebody else without a cloud cover of water on the face is somebody else. It's always somebody else. Somebody else is always somebody else. Somebody else.
That was Jane Cortez, from Jane Cortez and the Fire Spitters, Taking the Blues Back Home, a cut called Global Inequalities. It's always somebody else's problem, right? And that's something we want to talk about right now. In Laura's book, Resilient Agriculture, she has a list on page 206, the 12 things you can do to cultivate a resilient agriculture. And number 4 is stop believing that somebody else will save us or that nobody can save us.
Thank
Ladies?
you. Yes, thank you. So we were talking earlier about how I ended up writing a book and how I got to a place where I just thought that if no one else is going to do this, I need to do this. And as I was saying earlier, I began collecting stories from farmers and ranches around the country. And as I was writing that first edition, it was incredibly important to me that I share very authentically their voices in this book. And I put a lot of time and effort into doing that, and didn't spend any time with my own voice. And then, as I was saying earlier, the book came out. I went on a book tour, and I was so surprised that so many people were interested in me and my experience of this work. And I started to understand that, first of all, I had a voice, and that it was right for me to share that voice. And I think in that way, in that process, I really began to live that step of don't stop thinking somebody else is going to fix it or nobody can fix it. And I really stepped into, with confidence and power, my role in this work of confronting climate change and all the other inequalities that are associated with these times. Mm-hmm. And I knew that I needed help. I needed help. I needed courage. I needed someone else to be able to say to me, yes, that writing is good, or yes, that writing is you. And although I have to say, when I first reached out to Meredith, I don't think I imagined how the conversation would go is, yes, that's you. I think more I wanted, yes, that's good. But that's what she did, and one reason that I chose Meredith is, ever since I've known her, and as she said earlier, we've gone back a long time, I thought her writing was just incredibly powerful and beautiful, and particularly inviting, and that's what I wanted to find my own version of that. And so I wonder, Meredith, if you could talk a little bit more about your own work and finding your voice.
Sure. Thank you, by the way, for your compliment of my writing. I have always been a writer. It's always a little bit been like a thing I can't help. You know what I mean? And I came to Warren Wilson to be a writer, but then I found agriculture and realized what I wanted to write about. But I think that I've always seen myself kind of as an artist before, like you see yourself as a scientist, right? But for me, like even before I was a farmer, I'm like, well, this is just a different type of art. Like this is the art I'm going to make now, and I'm going to write about it. And interestingly, my books came about, and where I made that choice of like, oh man, I'm going to have to step into, like some ownership of my role, was I had been farming and I had a butcher shop here in town, and I went through a really horrible divorce and lost everything. I lost my land, I lost my shop, and everything that I thought was like mine or what I was doing or how I was contributing. And I was kind of left with nothing except for all this knowledge that I had gathered about food systems and land through getting a degree and trying to run a farm and trying to participate. And I think a lot of farmers, young farmers specifically, get into farming today because they feel really committed to systems change, and they don't realize they're activists, right? They're just like, oh, this is cool or whatever, but they feel really convicted about it. And I was the same. But when I got into doing it, I was realizing just how difficult it is to do like small scale farming, right? And small scale retail, food business inside of the very broken global food system that everyone takes for granted, right? And so when I lost my businesses, I was like, oh, somebody's got to tell this story, right? Somebody's got to tell this story that that readies people to really participate, but also in a way that like brings it alive through my own experience. So my book is like I had to fight to do a technical book about butchery, but to weave in like personal narrative of my memories of being with animals, or my
when you say you had to fight, do you mean with your publishers or with yourself?
With myself, and with, I think I struggled with a decent amount of imposter syndrome, certainly being a woman, being young, being new to butchery. Like I wasn't new to food and farming, but butchery is definitely like a cool kid's dudes thing, it was when I got into it, and I really didn't know very much about it, and was originally going to write the book along with a butcher, another butcher who's male. But then that didn't work out, and I was like almost not going to do it. But then I just thought, I just had this like, I really honestly like middle of the night, like, no, I'm going to do this. I think I got to do this. And kind of just started that journey, but realized that like in order to do it in a way that felt good to me, in a way that felt real to me, like this personal narrative was going to have to be woven into it, and I think, that's a thing that just kind of was necessary for my process, but that, for you, like, I think it was built in afterwards.
Well, let me ask this. Is personal narrative important for everyone to address climate change? When we say stop thinking, that somebody else is going to do this or that I can't do anything about it, what about just, someone walking in the street who's not a scientist, who has no knowledge of foodways, but does understand at this point that climate change is real? How can they step out of that, feeling that they can't do anything about it?
There's lots of ways.
There are lots of ways, and I created a list of 12 in resilient agriculture. And I think we were talking about putting that on your website so folks can
right. But
can take a look at it.
We were saying stop believing that somebody else. Yeah. But so how do we stop?
Yeah,
believing
how do you stop believing? Well, I actually think so. I have actually learned a lot about hope in this work I do because it is dark. There are dark places in this work, and I write about that in the second edition as well. And short and sweet, what I understand about hope is that the way that we find real hope, genuine hope, is by getting involved, by participating. And you asked, is personal narrative a part of climate change work? And I would say absolutely, because I think that until you are ready, as I talked about earlier, and you sort of said this, Meredith, in a little bit different way, I did feel like I stepped into my power as an individual, as a person with perspective and a fair amount of knowledge, and began to tell a story. And I think that's important, particularly when we are facing something as big and overwhelming as how do we respond to climate change. Finding that place, Meredith mentioned it earlier, connecting on an emotional or more spiritual level with other people, and also seeking that in yourself as a way to power or fuel the work.
Well, I think we all have a personal narrative with our experience of what is going on with climate change.
Absolutely.
Right? And so if we can get in touch, like even if it's just that this heat is just so overwhelming, that's
or I
a
feel
personal
anxiety.
Experience, right?
Yeah, everybody has a narrative related to it. And then I think the narrative just then begs the question of like, what can I do? What can I do? So I think it's important to mention that there are a lot of things to do, but not everything's appropriate for everyone. So that's another reason participation is so important, is to first of all, you have to be forgiving of yourself based on your context, and then choose the entry point that works best for you.
Right. Well, I think in my experience, I was homesteading with my now ex-husband, and now I'm learning to manage the property. And it took me a while to transition from tilling the soil, which I wasn't going to do anyway. It was something I always admired watching him do, but I wasn't going to till. And then I learned about that really tilling is not the best way to treat your soil. And then I've gone on from that to planting trees to create shade and trying to have the, levels of vegetation and so on and so forth. But so that would be my personal narrative, as somebody learning how to manage the land, and then see that in terms of climate change, to just collect the rainwater was a big step that I took. But so maybe people, not everybody has land to take that kind of approach, but everybody's living somewhere and experiencing something, right? And so from there, I think it's maybe important also to think about, like you said, that we're not in this alone. So you reached out to Meredith, Laura, to get some, just to have her make you feel good, basically. Yeah, that's a good idea. Or, yes, I acknowledge that you're going through this and thinking about these things. So maybe that's part of it, is just to reach out.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's the other part of the story of participating is it's clear from research. Again, I'm a research scientist. I can't get away completely from it. But what psychologists tell us about hope is that it's actually participation in community. Participation in community is what this animal that we call human, what we thrive in community, learning in community, doing in community, succeeding in community. And so that's a really important piece of it, too. And to Meredith's point about first giving yourself a little grace, a little bit of a break, because this is such an enormous challenge and it can be overwhelming, and then a very typical response is just to shut it off and be in denial. Because it is so overwhelming, find your way in. That was a very important goal for me of this edition was to invite the reader in and welcome them in and say, find your way. Here's some ideas for finding your way.
What is your authentic voice?
Yeah.
Where is
what
that
is your
entry point?
Where is your authentic voice, and where do you want to get started? And I'm here. I'm here holding this space. It's a safe space. Mm-hmm. Let's talk. And me even saying that at one level blows my mind. That is not the writer I started out
It's been
being.
a journey to get to that point.
It's been quite a journey, yeah. But I'm very happy to be here. And Meredith played a very important role in that. So I want to shout out maybe to all excellent editors, for all writers.
Well, and we're speaking to writers and readers on this show.
Yeah.
And so I think for writers who want to use their power as a writer to help also, I mean, that is an authentic way to enter this, is to write about just your experience, maybe, of climate change.
Yes.
Because everybody's experience is a legitimate experience, right?
Yeah, and I think also like extending that forgiveness to yourself as an artist. Like, you're not going to have the solutions for everybody. I think as writers, we feel really pressured to like end the piece with a really hopeful note or tie it up neatly or give people a solution, especially if we're writing about things like climate change or like, should you eat meat? But I think it's like, it's important to recognize like that was a journey for me too. Like, even though I always was putting my voice in, like I definitely felt pressure to have the answer and make it a one size fits all thing. And then in the second edition of the Ethical Meat Handbook, I really changed on that and was like, look, we're all struggling with so many different and disparate like contexts, and there are people who are in touch with the land and who are cultivating land or stewarding animals, and then there are people who will never touch soil in our society, right? So how do we like invite them, as you say, into this work? Certainly through food is a powerful way everyone eats, and how can we start to tell the story of like the natural cycles that everyone should ideally learn about if they want to participate in climate action work, through the metaphors of food and digestion, right? And so, maybe food waste is the next thing to talk about, because that's like we're talking very generally right now.
Everybody eats, right?
Yeah,
so
specifics.
We were saying, how can everybody get involved?
Yeah.
Everybody eats, and the simplest thing, Laura?
The very first of the 12 steps is to stop wasting food. Yes.
And why is that number one?
Why is that number one? Well, I ordered these steps in order of what I would describe as, or what were the easiest to hardest for me, or what took the least amount of effort to the most effort for me.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and so they're ordered roughly, and it just, and I'm not even really saying that the first step isn't hard, because I actually have found that it's difficult to not waste food, and Meredith
I have as well.
Yeah, and Meredith can speak about this as a chef and a farmer. She's really worked on some interesting projects to take nose to tail kind of.
Well, you've taken that to another level with the butchery and not wasting any part of the animal.
And with fermentation.
And with plants too, like looking at from root to tip.
Right, using every part of everything. Okay.
Yeah. But what I wanted to say about the 12 steps is really what I tried to do with this list is this was my effort to create a place to invite people in wherever they are. Like, what's the first step?
Right.
Or what's the most interesting step? Just to create this broad, as I said earlier, safe space to begin participating, to begin acting.
But so why is it so important not to waste food?
Oh, you really want to know about this?
I do.
No, that's fine. There are different levels of answer to that question, but I'm going to just give you the natural science or the material answer to that question. So food, the production of food, the whole food system produces a pretty significant proportion of greenhouse gas emissions. Let's talk about in this country.
Okay.
And when we waste food, we are wasting all of the resources that were put into creating that food and getting that food to your supermarket. And all of those resources have associated greenhouse gas emissions. And so if we simply stop wasting food, purchase what we need to eat, we send a signal back through the food system to reduce production. In this country, between 30 and 40% of all edible food is wasted. I'm going to say that again. 30 to 40% of what we buy is thrown away.
And that's all contributing to climate change.
And all of that is contributing to climate change, the food that we buy. And then when we landfill the wasted food, that's an additional emissions. And the last I heard, maybe Meredith, you've got current information about this, but the last I looked at this data, it turns out that if food waste was a country, it is the third it produces, behind just China and the U.S., the third most greenhouse gas emissions.
Wow.
When you think about it that way, you can begin to understand why stop wasting food.
And why stop thinking that nobody else can save us.
Right? Yeah.
Because that's something we can all do. Just stop. It's so simple.
Well, it sounds
so simple. It is simple, but it's not easy.
It's not easy, yes. That's a great way to put it. It's simple, but it is not easy. Yeah. Even for me, and I'm very motivated and all of this, I wrote the book, and I still find, like many other people, that Tupperware in the back corner that just never got.
But then if we take it another level deeper than just what we're leaving in the refrigerator and so on, even when we choose to go to the supermarket and just buy certain cuts, I think, Meredith, you could speak to that a little more, that there's other ways that food is being wasted just by the choices we're making as consumers.
Yeah, and I think it's important to mention that, like, of the sectors of our food system, like the meat system wastes less than any other sector. Because there are the parts and pieces of the system in place to really make use of the whole animal. Like, animal products are used in all kinds of different consumer goods. And that is made possible by, like, the rendering conglomerate of companies that come and take all the things that we don't necessarily choose to eat. And we don't necessarily have that in the vegetables, nuts, oilseeds, and pulses sectors of our food system. So a lot more of that type of food is wasted from, like, farm gate to home waste can. So that's pretty interesting. But I think furthermore, like, people who struggle with just the idea of eating animals would be moved by the fact that, like, for the most part, we are only eating, like, 30% of the animal fresh, and the rest of it is, like, having to be dealt with by this huge corporate system, right? Because we're having a hard time making use of it just, like, on the community scale or on the home scale. And so that's what whole animal butchery seeks to do, is just take a more holistic approach to it and say, look, we really want to honor the life of this animal and also reduce waste and also, feed ourselves more economically and more deliciously. Like, how can we use every scrap?
Okay.
As eaters.
But so why is it so difficult? Like, other than, like, leaving that Tupperware in the back of the refrigerator, what about, like, I think people waste sometimes when they go to restaurants too. Like, there's a lot of like huge portions at restaurants.
Yeah.
What else has people, like, makes it hard for people to not waste food?
I think it's like we don't eat with intention, like And yeah, a lot of that stuff isn't decided for us. If you go to a restaurant and the portion sizes are huge, then you can't. So there's some like systemic changes that probably need to be made to portion sizing. No, definitely need to be made to portion sizing. But even on our own, when we're helping ourselves, like at the potluck or at home, I can't even tell you how many times my kids get way more food than they are going to eat. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter how many times we note to them, like, are you going to eat all that? Or, just don't take more than you can eat. Like, it's still almost habitual because it's like, where's your mind? Or like, where's your energy? It's somewhere else when you're like going to eat your food. But a lot of these practices in the 12 steps and other places, like in my book, are like really asking us to come back into relationship with the food, like with the land, and put some more intention into it. And I think that even just setting the intention to stop wasting food checks you into that kind of thinking that you might not have had before. And even if you're like Laura freaking Lengnick and you do it imperfectly, you have the intention, right? And that having the intention really does make a change.
Yeah.
It does. Because I really took it to heart from the last time you came and I interviewed you. From that time till now, I've been cleaning out my pantry, and I still haven't gotten to the end of it. Now, I wouldn't say I was going to waste that food, but on the other hand, how long do I need, to have some boxes of noodles sitting there on my shelf just to feel like I have something in my pantry, Or so it's made me more conscious, like you said, just to think about that rule and try to keep in mind, and even the attendant waste, like if your kids order pizza and then you have the pizza box or you have the aluminum wrapping and all of those other things that come with it.
I think you raise a good point, though, about security, like feelings of security, Martha, like people during COVID hoarding food because they were so afraid they couldn't get it. And even still, like I'm a bit of a food hoarder. I'm not going to lie. I like to have, stuff in the pantry. I like to have excess abundance, right? So that if I don't have a plan.
Well, we probably should have stuff in the pantry.
Right. And because the food system is fragile, it's like, it is hard to balance that. So it's another reason.
But do we need like that exotic spice jar from, the sale rack section because it looks interesting and then we bring it home and we don't actually use it?
Right. So this intention to stop wasting food like invites us into all these other questions for ourselves. Like, do I need that expensive exotic spice, or do I need that gadget or packaging gizmo that my friend told me or that I heard on the morning show or whatever it is? And similarly, like maybe I should learn how to make homemade pickles. Like if I don't, if it's not just about throwing things away, is it about then learning to ferment just something very small? Or is it about learning about worm composting? Like what could be fun or cool that would help me get to this goal of not wasting food?
Right.
Right. So it's an invitation.
It is an invitation. And Meredith and you both actually, Martha and Meredith, have both provided the listeners an example of what happens. So it's a pretty simple first step. Stop wasting food, and the different layers that you begin to encounter and the ways that you start to think about waste more generally, for example, or how do I use this? I want to, again, point out that Meredith has done a lot of really important work as a chef to think about using whole animals and also whole plants. And so that's a whole nother really fascinating universe to walk into when you're ready, when you want to open that door about just how to use foods.
So if our listeners are ready, the title of the book is Pure Charcuterie, The Craft and Poetry of Curing Meats at Home by Meredith Leigh, who's joined me here in the studio with Laura Lengnick. You're tuned to WPVM 103.7, the voice of Asheville. My name is Martha Senator, and this is Listen and Be Heard. We're going to listen to a little music from Rising Appalachia, and we'll be back with another one of the points on the list.
trust the movement. I negate the chaos, uplift the negative. I'll show up at the table again and again and again. I'll close my mouth and learn to listen. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. 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 These times are poignant. The winds have shifted. It's all we can do to stay uplifted. Pipelines through backyards, wolves howling out fronts. Yeah, I got my crew, but truth is what I want. Realigned and on point, power to the peaceful, prayers to the waters, women at the center, all vessels open to give and receive. Let's see the system brought down to its knees. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. Whoa, whoa, oh, oh. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Ooh, ooh, ooh. I'm made of thunder, I'm made of lightning, I'm made of dirt, yeah, made of the fine things. My father taught me that I'm a speck of dust and this world was made for me. So let's go and try our luck, said I've got my roots down, 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 down deep. I've got my roots down, 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 down deep. I've got my roots down, down, down deep. I've got my roots down, down, down deep. So what are we doing here? What has been done? What are you gonna do about it when the world comes undone? My voice feels tiny, and I'm sure so does yours. Put us all together, make a mighty roar. I am resilient. I trust the movement. I negate the chaos, uplift the negative. I'll show up at the table again and again and again. I'll close my mouth and learn to listen.
This is WPVM 103.7 FM. My name is Martha Senator. This is Listen and Be Heard, and we're doing a 2-hour special about what you can do to cultivate resilient agriculture. I'm joined by Laura Lengnick, the author of Resilient Agriculture, and Meredith Leigh, author of Pure Charcuterie, The Craft and Poetry of Curing Meats at Home, and also the Ethical Meat Handbook, which preceded that. And Meredith, before we went to break, was talking about fermentation. We're going to go on to point number 6. Learn how your ancestors nourished their community. So fermentation is one of those ways.
Yeah, this is my favorite point on the list.
Why is it your favorite?
Well, I mean, for lots of reasons that we don't have time for. But I mean, one thing I wanted to say earlier is that different times of looking at the list, different ones have spoken to me, right? I think learn how your ancestors nourish their community has just been like a natural progression of my work, because I got into, farming and sustainable farming and butchery and whole animal butchery and whole animal utilization and charcuterie and fermentation. And really, at first, it was about like technical skills. Like, what technical skills could I acquire to help the movement towards resiliency or better food systems? And it was like, like many white folks, didn't realize that these were all ancestral practices and ancestral ways of knowing and interacting with the world. And my own journey of sort of like coming into a different sort of consciousness about the way that I participate with the earth and with other people has been, the food, my work in food has brought me along that journey. And so, at one time, I think, that learn how your ancestors nourish their community probably wouldn't have made a lot of sense to me as a way of cultivating resilience, right? But now I see very clearly why it's important.
Why?
I'm going to get there. Okay. But I do want to say that, like, when I looked at the list before the show, the one that spoke to me first was stop believing that somebody else will save us or that nobody can save us. Because after, 20 years of doing this, I do get burnout, and I start going, oh man, there's no hope, or I can't do anything more, right? So it just depends on when you look at it, I guess is what I would say. Okay. But going back to the ancestral foodways, I think, like, what has become so clear to me in my own self is like, because of my work in food and because of like starting with something as simple as stop wasting food, I have gone on a grand journey, right? That has completely rewired the way that I think about like myself as an animal, as a participant in nature, and my students, because I teach workshops about fermentation and teach workshops about butchery. They go through the same journey. I watch them like heal lots of trauma in the way that they relate to the world and to themselves. And what they're doing actually is like, and I'm like convinced of this, what they're doing is opening themselves to like something that all of our ancestors were very aware of, which is that we are part of nature. We're not separate from it. And our food system, the global food system that we are mostly dependent on, is really built around this kind of aspect of separation, right? Like, we're separate from the food system. The food system is really separate from cycles of nature.
And I've been wondering lately if it depends on us being separated like that,
Yeah, I think it sort of thrives on that illusion of separateness, as do many of our that
we can't like grow our own food. We can't do all these things for ourselves.
Yeah, or that we have to be dependent on other people, or that it's not, and it's not something that we have to be like conscientious about, right? Like, that somebody else is taking care of it, right? And we're
can
just
go
like,
on and have our important lives without thinking about the food we're eating.
Yeah, and I think, and that becomes very important, specifically when people face the question of eating meat. I think it's been something that I have been invited to become the at times controversial spokesperson for how our like fear of this topic, and the immediate controversy of the topic of eating meat really invites us into this sort of like uncomfortable question of like, what are all the things that we're sort of ignoring because we have like the privilege to do so, or because this food system that we're beholden to separates us from the concepts of death, right? That happen in order for food to be available to us, or, even vegetables. Like, it's not, nature is not all like waterfalls and rainbows, right? Like the lion still eats the zebra, right? Like,
But I think what our ancestors did was they kept it in balance more. They took what they needed
Well, I think that, and there's an argument that, like, you know, we can't necessarily recreate that because there were fewer of us then, right?
But,
and we were
but that's
closer
what we
to
need
the
to learn
systems.
from them. Like when you talk about even like picking our vegetables or going out there and harvesting, if you're foraging, maybe you're not going to just like wipe out everything that's there. You're going to take what you need.
Exactly. The way I would characterize it is that it's not, okay, here it is, Martha. Humans are of nature. Therefore, nothing that humans do is unnatural. So when we're leaning all the way into the big ugly thing, like everything that we've done, and even if it's like, you know, categorized by us as anti-nature, it is of nature.
It's our nature.
Because we've done it and we are of nature, right? But what's missing is a certain level of consciousness about how we're going about being participant natural beings, right? And that's something our ancestors did bring, was a certain level of consciousness of like, this plant, this herb, this animal is my brother, you know, and I have to ask permission or I have to be in reciprocal relationship. And I think that that's something that, you know, the practices of fermentation or even composting or butchery or farming really opens people to, like, you get your hands into the microbes in the fermentation or the soil, and it's like something wakes up where you're like, oh yeah, I am like connected to this, and everything that's trying to convince me that I'm not connected to this is just wrong. And so how am I going to now?
And it tastes so good. If there's one thing that your books conveyed to me was just the pleasure of good tasting, nutritious food.
Sure. And like, yeah, going back to science and how like we want to take the best parts of science, right? But we also want to say like, you know, I can read all the articles in the world that say like, oh, food isn't medicine, or, you know, it doesn't matter how something is grown to how many vitamins and minerals. Like, I do not believe that. Like after all the work that I've done, you know, and after standing in front of the bodies of countless animals and being asked to make the best use of that body, you're not going to tell me that an animal raised in confinement, you know, and in suffering is just as good for my body when I take it in as an animal that lived outdoors freely and, you know, like moved its body and saw the sunlight, right? Because I know I've touched it and I've felt it. So I think that, you know, understanding how, going back to the point, understanding how ancestral your ancestors nourished their communities, we're not just talking about like what foods did they eat or what practices did they do, although those things are very important because those are the doorways into the consciousness. I think we're also talking about like a heightened, you know, connection and consciousness to our world, you know, and ourselves that allows for more resilience. And I want to shut up and let Laura talk on this point as well.
Before you shut up, just let me ask you, for people who don't really know about fermentation, maybe you could give a quick sort of view of what that means to like maybe take on fermenting into your bag of tricks in the kitchen.
Yeah, that's a really fair question because I think some people don't, like, they think of it as gross or weird, like they think of it as kind of rotting and
or just not familiar with it. But personally, I've been making like fermented sodas from my excess berries.
That's one of the best, easiest things to do, and
it's so delicious.
It is so good, isn't it?
But so
it's basically it's like the microbial transformation of foods to, you know, sometimes a semi-stable state and sometimes a fully shelf-stable state. So what you're actually drawing on is like lots of different microbial processes. So we could go on forever and ever about what all the different types of fermentation are, but basically all you're doing is like, usually with salt or sugar and just a few extra little tweaks, you're creating an environment that instead of like that food sitting on your counter and rotting, it just invites in all these microorganisms that are already on the food to, specifically with wild fermentation, to like transform it really deliciously and beautifully. And what we're learning through great science is that that's really, really good for our bodies, right? And our ancestors knew this, figured this out, felt this, intuited this, that not only did our nomadic ancestors have to like throw their food over the back of a horse and ride away, so they better figure out how to preserve it, right? Like they also figured out like, oh, this makes me feel better, or this increases my health outcomes, right? And so, yeah, now our modern science is starting to show, well, yeah, there's something to that. Like our guts need those microbes, and they also need like high fiber foods to feed those microbes in our gut. And so fermentation is a very hot topic right now, and incredibly easy to just start in one jar.
It's very simple.
Yes, on your counter.
Whether it's vegetables or making soda, like I said, or any number of things.
And soda is a great example because most fermented vegetables, for example, have like a bit of a sour leaf flavor. And if people aren't into that, then there are ways to have like sweet flavored ferments. And I think another thing, like for me, because I'm always bringing in that like metaphor and dimension, like when we spoke earlier about how we're living in a really urbanized world now, where a lot of people won't touch soil, or they won't be farming, or they won't really think that agriculture is part of their life. But when you have a jar of something on your counter that's like actually has like a whole ecosystem inside of it, you know, and you have to just take the time to learn like, well, what actually is going on in there? Okay, what's happening is that these little bacteria are going in there and eating these sugars, and they're pooping out acids and alcohols, and they're actually even dying in there. And what I taste when I taste the fermented pickle is not just like the acids and alcohols, but also like the enzymes from the death process. Like the whole life process of agriculture is going on in that jar. And I think if like, it's the same as like you said, an intention to stop wasting food, or if you start learning about fermentation, like that's also a window into more intention or more connection
and
or
a
more
way
resilience.
to not waste food.
Exactly. Right. So it's all connected, and it's all it's a little bit of a trick, actually, Martha. Like we're being a little tricksy, because it's almost like no matter where you enter, you're just going to peel back a little bit of the veneer, and then this just big, beautiful world like exposes itself to you of how you can participate and really start living in a way that's not only like better for climate change, but also like you're going to feel great. You know what I mean?
So how is fermentation better for climate change?
Oh my gosh, how is it? Of course, you both look at the scientist. Yeah,
of course. You're our local expert, Laura.
Yeah, I think that what I'm going to do is sidestep that question just to say, just to say that these 12 steps will take you through changes, as we've been describing, that are way bigger than climate change and many other benefits, both to land, people, and community, than simply reducing emissions, for example. But to try to answer your question specifically, I think one way that I think about fermenting, because I'm a relatively new fermenter, and every time I do it, all I've done is salt ferment vegetables from my garden into a jar and with a little salt. But every time I do it, I have two feelings that come, really strong, very satisfying feelings that come up. And the first one is, this is so easy. And the second one is, and people have been doing this for thousands of years. It feels so important to me that I am enacting such a simple yet profound experience in my kitchen, in my little kitchen in Asheville in 2023. So both of those things are really important. Those feelings are really important to me. To answer your question, I think the way to think about fermentation and climate change is just that if you are growing, there is no more effective way for eaters to reduce the emissions associated with food the food system than to grow something on a box on their balcony or in their backyard and take it into their kitchen and cut it up by hand and put it in a jar and add some salt.
No truck involved, no gasoline,
No, nothing.
hopefully no fertilizers either.
Well, yeah, and but even with some of those things, there is still the carbon footprint, if you will,
Yes.
of that food.
No plastic wrapper.
Exactly, and you reuse that jar, you know, and so I do think. That the benefits of something like fermentation far outweigh or much broader than just climate change. But when we think about learning some skills, some foodway skills, that you can, with a few very simple tools and ingredients, can preserve food, that is a real resilience benefit as well, because you there's a confidence. So I carry this confidence around with me, and oh my gosh, I know Meredith must as well, because she knows way more than I do. But even though I walk through this modern world and I can go buy these great ferments that all the local businesses in Nashville are making and really enjoy them, I know how to do it at home. And that gives me a sense of confidence walking through the world that if there was another disruption to the food system,
You know how to do that.
I know how to do that. Yeah.
What else should we know how to do? Meredith, what are some of the other
First, I want to make a shameless plug for my company, The Fermentation School, because it is a way for people to learn how to ferment things at home, and it's all women-run and women taught courses, online courses, self-paced, lifetime access. So
and where can people go?
Fermentationschool.com.
Okay.
So that's just quick. And also I wanted to say that the recultivation and re-recognition of the benefits of fermentation is having larger impacts on climate change. There are biomimicry projects going on all over the world where people are taking like the things that happen through like fungal fermentation or yeast fermentation and trying to apply those processes to really big world problems, you know, like waste, breaking down wastes in like Superfund areas and things like that. So there's a lot of, to answer your original question, there's a lot of ways that fermentation impacts climate change.
Okay. Even more than I realized.
And so I think the important thing is like the point that we're talking about is learn how your ancestors nourished their community, not just so that you have some cool history facts, right? But so that you can like raise your consciousness, participate more in your own community nourishment, and possibly merge like the best of what we've discovered through modern science with like this amazing wisdom that our ancestors like gifted us, and that honestly the land gifts us. Like
right.
we're just in touch
I was
with
just
it.
thinking another example would probably be the knowledge of herbs.
Absolutely.
And medicinal herbs.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah. And think of what we can create, right? If we kind of synergize all of that knowledge and wisdom. And
what about,
honor it.
I don't know, other things, even like keeping house? Like what are some other ways that our ancestors nourished us? That somehow in the last, it's amazing to me actually how much we've forgotten in the space of 100 years.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not an expert in ancestral like ways of being, but I have studied it a lot. And one thing is like working together in community. I mean, this is something else that we talked about earlier. This like nuclear family, like separateness. Everybody has to
I think
provide for themselves, and isolation. And that's something I talk about in my book too, especially for people who aren't farmers. Like if you live in a city, how the heck, like you're not going to butcher a whole pig, you know, but maybe you can get in community, right? And there could be some people who can participate with their skill, and some other people who participate with their money, and some other people who participate with like organizational capacity. And not everybody wants to eat everything. So we share in that. And I think that's something that our ancestors left, you know, that capacity for us. And we inherited it. Like it takes a village, you know, to really build systems that nourish. Do you want to say anything about that, Laura?
I would just add that, so absolutely understanding how to do things in community. I think understanding, recognizing that we have enough, this idea of abundance, and that the way we have enough is to share resources in community. Then the other thing I think is incredibly important in these times is that another, I think, an indigenous lesson that we can learn is the idea that we are not by ourselves on our own, but we are standing on the shoulders of our ancestors, that we all, no matter where we come from or what our family history might be, there are ancestors in our lines. And sometimes they're not even related by blood, but they're related by spirit, and that we can ask for help, and we can find strength and courage and wisdom by calling on those ancestors. I think that's a really important aspect of understanding how Indigenous communities operated as well, and something that we can do. We can do again. I know because I've learned how to do it.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point too, like giving yourself belonging to the world, like, and to the ancestral ties. Like, I think a lot of times, especially white folks, don't feel like we have the authority to speak about ancestors, right? Because like we are,
but we all have
colonialists.
ancestors.
Yeah,
right?
but we do. We know everybody has an ancestor that knew how to live on the earth in a way that was conscientious, right? And so while people of color and Native folk do have a closer cultural tie to that knowledge and should be listened to, absolutely, I think that it's also time for everyone to like just step into a recognition that we all have ancestors. We all have,
when
like,
you talk about white folk, that's a pretty vast group of cultures.
Yes,
actually.
absolutely.
So we could go back to some of the different ancestral roots of those, and there's a great variety, really, of the knowledge that's back there.
Yeah. And that there's a lot of ways to listen for knowledge that you have available to you, right? Like it comes from the land, it comes from spirit, it comes from people, it comes from animals.
From poetry, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think it's about time for a poem, if you'd like to share one with us,
Sure,
Meredith.
yeah, I can say a poem.
Thank you. Take your time.
I just have to.
My name is Martha Senator, and you're listening to Listen and Be Heard. And my guests are Laura Lengnick, author of Resilient Agriculture, and Meredith Leigh, who is about to share some poetry with us.
Thanks, Martha. This poem doesn't have a title, because a lot of my poems don't have titles. But I wrote it for one of my kids originally, but I think it applies to what we're talking about, because this poem's about ways of thinking, and it's about a radical act of like belonging to the world as a way of making the world a better place. So, of all the ideas in the world, I think seagulls are my favorite, at least in the way we were talking yesterday. And I was seeing if you could flip over the thing that was in your mind, the way the gulls spin and twirl in mid-flight, surprising themselves. Your mind is young and deep for its age, like tall grass that lives in a hurry. Out of it now comes a red-winged blackbird, just up and over the seed tips, a clean shock of red across its shoulders. It is after something, some bug of existence, and so it goes down and black and up and bright, doggedly beautiful. The gulls dive down too and crash against the water, just as I hunt for ways to show you that you are fit for the world, just as you are. Across the marsh, the gulls beat in hundreds of directions. Steady, twisting, free fall, float, weaving something unseeable. It's that we have this one life, and everything is an idea. Even the winning strike that breaks just below the surface and manages to fetch something shining.
Life, the raw material in which to shape joy and meaning, spirit and science in a mix, graceful movement in space, a martial dance in the midst of disease. Time sacred, word and light, strong medicine, action prayerful, move wisdom, breathe consciousness. This is an army of healers. Physician, heal thyself and radiate, radiate. The flowers have eyes, and if they had mouths, their song would slay us. They know that the chains on our tongues are rusty and blue. A slow suicide that stretches out over a lifespan, if not freed by the courage of motion. Unleashed thought, kindled in the fireplace, raw enough to see the flowers looking up at us, with no mouth in which to slay us with song. You see, Arthur learned to finger the saxophone by picking cotton with bloody fingers at the age of 5. He moistened his reed with tears he collected as he sang in spirituals by his grandmother's knees. When he played, his guts spilled out the bell of his horn, and sometimes he vomited flowers, sometimes barbed wire. It depended on what his heart had to stomach the night before. Arthur was born in America and raised in the housing projects. He did not speak English, just broken pig Latin and fluent saxophone, and a little Spanish he learned from his neighbors. This is an army of healers. Physician, heal thyself and radiate, radiate. Tribal scars decorate the cheeks of the young scholars, endangered as those in tar pits, savage red streets, rip the life of innocence, bleeding in shadows of impotent parents, swimming in bills and dogma. Here the buildings lean and peel, flattened to the ground by the fat butt of smog. Hieroglyphics sprayed on walls as precision lobotomies are executed from ears with organized static from ghetto blasters. Young minds left bleeding, naked in front of snot-covered TVs. In a garden of suffering, you do better talking to trees, for at least the trees talk back. At least the trees talk back. The essence of the work is healing, rebuilding a circle, promoting the life force, unearthing the raw jewels, uniting the scars to make something beautiful. This is an army of healers. Physician, heal thyself and radiate, radiate. This is an army of healers. Physician, heal thyself and radiate, radiate.
This is WPVM 103.7, the voice of Asheville. My name is Martha Senator, and the show is Listen and Be Heard. In the studio with me is Laura Lengnick and Meredith Leigh. And the next thing we want to talk about of the 12 things you can do to cultivate a resilient agriculture is number 10. Participate in your regional food shed. What does that mean? What is a food shed?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Laura.
What is a food shed? Meredith, you could answer this too. So a food shed, as I understand it, is an idea of viewing the food system like a watershed. So streams move into rivers, move out to the ocean, and so water very naturally moves through a landscape in a certain pattern. And so food shed is an idea that we can think about food that way. It's not quite as clean. You can think of it as a leaky watershed, perhaps. But food moves through areas. In case we've talked a lot about the global food system, and so food is moving continuously. I mean, if you really think about it, it's kind of incredible how much food moves through the world. But that's the basic idea, that a food shed is describing where food starts, the food that ends up on your plate. You kind of can follow it back through its journey to where it began.
So we have a global food system, but we also each live within a regional food shed. Would that be an accurate thing to say?
No, I think, jump in here, Meredith, if you want to get involved. No, I think we live in a global food shed at the moment.
Okay.
So depending on what's on your plate, some of it could have traveled halfway across the world to get to you.
Yeah, the way I kind of approach this in my book is about thinking about different scales of economy. Like, I call one the first economy, which is like what you can produce yourself. And because I think it's important to remember that it's possible to produce food at any place in the world, right? And we've seemed to have forgotten that, right? So when possible, food comes from that first economy, and it's not possible for everyone. And then there's the middle economy, which is like we're attempting to rebuild in a lot of ways alongside of the external economy, which is the global food system, right? So the regional food shed I would describe as like this middle economy, right? That is attempting to be rebuilt, like in tandem with and alongside of the global food system, where we have, regional actors who are not only producing food, but also processing food and distributing food and eating food. And so I think the important point to me about this step is how thinking about, we've invoked the word community a lot in this conversation. We've invoked the word global food system, right? So what is the appropriate size for thinking about community or food system, or what does local even mean, and how important is local when we're thinking about, okay, making actual meaningful strides toward resilient agriculture? And I think Laura and I both believe that the regional scale is like the most appropriate, realistic, and effective scale for. And so, Laura, maybe you can talk about that.
Talk about all the science that supports that idea.
Well, could we start with the difference between local and regional?
Yeah, so there are different definitions, but when we think about, but I guess as I think about it, local is generally a smaller scale that you're drawing from, a smaller area that you're drawing your foods from. So they're traveling over to try to keep this conversation aligned with the idea of a foodway. A food shed. The food is coming from closer to you with a local. In a local system.
Okay.
In a regional system, it's coming from farther away, but still within some miles of you. But it's generally a longer trip that it's taking, and so that would be, I think, Meredith, your first and second economies, and yeah,
Yep.
yeah, and the evidence that I know that's convinced me that it's really regional food system. Regional food is what we need to be focused on creating. Is the evidence that local food system, local is probably too small, and that what we need to actually size our food system, our food sheds, the way we need to size our food sheds is to look at the capacity, the ecological capacity of a place to produce the foods that we need. And to be able to produce those foods without an ecological deficit.
So the idea is that by doing it regionally and not pulling foods from all over the world, say, that we're reducing the footprint of producing that food and getting it to our table.
And we're also enhancing or increasing the self-reliance of that region. We're not so dependent on faraway places.
Yes.
That's the resilience piece, yeah.
I think if you think about, I mean, if you work in the system like we do, and giving you a perfect example, when it comes to rebuilding a meat supply chain that's decentralized. So we know from COVID times that 4 or 5 companies control most of the meat supply globally.
Right.
And so, during COVID, there was like a huge demand on small scale slaughter facilities, right? And family owned abattoirs that they could not meet because there literally are not enough. And this was a problem even before COVID. So everybody thinks that COVID caused the problem, but it was already a problem. It
exposed the problem.
Yes, it exposed the problem, and it continues to be a problem. And so if we started thinking about trying to create an abattoir that could serve the meat-eating public of every locality, then we could very quickly see that that's not realistic, right? But if we start looking at like bioregions or regions that include cities and their outlying rural areas, then we can start to see, how do we create smaller than global or smaller than national, but larger than local systems that have the right number of players and the interdependence that is realistic towards decentralizing the
land capacity
that it's dependent on. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, one of the debacles of that is that people don't want to spend more money. Is that true?
Well, I think that's a real issue. Because the type of meat
you're talking about is going to be more expensive.
Absolutely. Here's the thing. I think it's also like, yes, food should cost more than it does. We know that we pay for it through our tax dollars. Not all of us know this. Here we go.
Right.
A lot of the food that we're buying very cheaply at the point of sale is actually subsidized. So we're paying for it with our tax dollars. We're just not paying for it at the grocery register. So, Fun fact.
And we're paying for it in all the damage that's being done with changing weather patterns
and damage to our
weather
health.
And our damage to our health.
Yes. So we're paying for it. It's
we're
just
paying
like
for it.
in pieces over time and to different pockets, right? But it's still the true cost of the food. And so, yes, it should cost more, but also we have systemic poverty in our country that makes people literally unable to pay the true cost of food at the point of sale. So that has to be acknowledged. It's not just about willingness. It's about capability and accessibility, right? And so, that's a huge issue that certainly local food has not answered, right? And regional food sheds don't have any promise that, therefore food will be affordable according to today's standards and also more resilient, right?
So part of that equation is for those people whose authentic way is to get politically involved, perhaps, to address those types of subsidies where the biggest players are getting the biggest subsidies, and that's why the food is cheaper, like you said, at the cash register, but it's not actually cheaper. So maybe that's a way to participate in your regional foodways.
Absolutely,
to try to address some of those policies.
And I say that in my book, you're not always going to be like the person that goes to the farmer's market. While going to the farmer's market is an excellent way to start participating in your regional food shed because it's putting you in a relationship with the food producers. That's not culturally appropriate for everyone. Some people don't have the transportation. Some people don't have the money. And so maybe the way that they participate is with their voice, or maybe the way that they participate is through opting out of certain products, or maybe the way that they participate is through just feeding neighbors and sharing, right? Like if we decide to stop wasting food, then maybe one thing we're doing is, sharing it with our neighbors
instead of letting it go to waste.
And it doesn't have to be perfectly ethical, organic, right? It just has to be like wherever you're at with whatever you have, trying to step into community relationship participation, right? In the way that's accessible to you. Because we do know that there are real problems with cost, accessibility, all the things. And it's not about like preachy one-size-fits-all solutions.
Right. It's not like, well, go pay for that steak that you can't afford.
Right.
Nobody's saying that.
Right. And I think the other thing of that is like you find a lot of rhetoric within food movements about one-size-fits-all solutions, or specifically within the meat world, like, oh, animals can be so helpful for sequestering carbon, therefore we need more of them and everyone should eat more meat. And I'm very, very adamant that that's not correct. Because we don't have the systems, right, to process all those animals, even produce all those animals, or make them, that meat affordable to everybody. So it is the solution to not eat meat. It is part of the solution, right? And so eating less meat, eating no meat, eating better meat,
those are all
acceptable solutions to participating in a regional resilient food shed.
Well, we've been talking with Laura Lengnick and Meredith Leigh, and we've been going through this list of 12 things you can do to cultivate a resilient agriculture. We've gotten through 4 of them, and we've been talking for almost 2 hours. If you want to see what the other 8 of them are, there's a couple ways you can do that. One is that you could get Laura's book, and you won't regret it, I promise. It's called Resilient Agriculture, Cultivating Food Systems for a Changing Climate. If you can't get the book and you would still like to see the list, I'm going to post it along with the podcast of this show tomorrow at listenandbeheard.net. I encourage people to go there to subscribe so that you'll find out about all the wonderful programs and articles that we publish there. But these 12 things you can do, you also mentioned the 3 rules of resilience in the book.
Yes, and I that's a great question, because Meredith said earlier, and she's exactly right, there's nothing about regional food systems that guarantees resilience or equity or a just transformation of the food system. However, we can use resilience science, or what I like to think of as resilience thinking, to begin to make decisions about how we want to rebuild these regional food systems. And that's where the 3 rules come in. They can be used as design criteria, so we want to think about design. They can also be used as management criteria. And so the 3 rules are, and we've actually touched on all of them in this conversation. The first rule is to create relationships of mutual benefit or reciprocal relationship. And so thinking through what that means very specifically is thinking through all the relationships in the food system and making sure that each relationship, both parties, are being cared for. So that's the first rule, which is cultivating reciprocal relationship throughout the food system. Mm-hmm. The second rule is regional self-reliance. So set up the food system so that it has a very little requirement for outside water, energy, materials from outside the region.
And that's because, we're looking forward to the day when a lot of those resources will be scarce. The gasoline, the things that the transportation we rely on may not be possible.
Well, yes, yes, that's true, but these rules are actually based on ecological truths of life on this planet. So it's not about what we're preparing for, but rather about how we might reimagine food systems to follow these natural ecological rules. And so this second one...
Maybe before it gets that bad.
How about that? Now, there's an idea. There's an idea. Yeah, so this second rule of regional self-reliance is just basically very simply saying we want to be able to create and support a high quality of life for all the people and all the other living things in our region without the need to extract resources from other places, and so to impoverish other places. And then the really actually very tough part of regional self-reliance is, and without releasing waste into the environment, if we're thinking about into the atmosphere, if we're thinking about climate change. So that's regional self-reliance. I think we can do it. I think there's good evidence we can, but that's pretty tough. That's a pretty tough.
I wanted to interject in there because I think a lot of that is really counter to like capitalistic thought.
Oh,
because it also because it has to do with also not just reducing waste or not extracting and impoverishing others, but also not hoarding wealth. So like if there's business owners listening, like what we're talking about is like radically rethinking like the service area and like the maximum customer potential maybe of like the business idea, and like thinking about how it can be ecologically resilient and regionally serviceable and not just like stakeholder pleasing and like wealth hoarding, right? So
which is extracting and not giving back, right?
Yeah, and I think it's just like we acknowledge that what we're saying is radical, like in our times, but it is possible. And I think that going back to the beginning of the program, we talked about COVID, and what we saw is that we didn't rely on the huge systems. What we did was we helped each other.
We had to turn to each other.
Exactly. And so what an amazing idea it would be to go ahead and start reimagining our systems to do that now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no need to wait.
Yeah.
There's no need to wait. And in fact, the longer we invest to maintain the existing systems, what that means is that gets us farther down the road of not making the changes we need, and we waste all of that investment in
all those emissions
and everything else. So
I was listening to someone on YouTube, and I don't remember who they were now, but they were involved with the UN and climate change, and were just so frustrated about the lack of action and all the talk and no action. But that's the reason why we have to take things into our own hands and each be responsible for the climate.
Or begin to participate, as we've said all along.
Right.
So that final rule is to cultivate the commonweal. And the word commonweal is actually an old word that my ancestors invented to describe the wealth of community, the broader wealth, not just money, but natural resources and human resources and social resources. All of that broad sense of wealth that we all know is important for a community for community well-being. So that's the third rule of resilience, and that's a pretty tough rule too. Yeah. We're certainly not operating that way now. But that said, and everything we've said about how radical these ideas are, I will say that in my work, one of the things that I do to help to spread ideas about resilience and teach about resilience is always connected to real programs, real projects that are trying out these ideas and figuring out within this system that doesn't support the three rules, figuring out how to make them work. So, and that...
Do you think it's possible within this system, or do we have to really change the system in a very fundamental way. When you're talking about capitalism, can we simultaneously have capitalism and
a more resilient economy?
Yes.
I think so. I think there's examples all over the world, and we can point to them. So I think it's possible. I think that... actually, Martha, I think this is a whole nother show to talk about capitalism, because actually there is a type of economics called regenerative economics, which is based on resilience science. And so I don't know if we're the right people.
Isn't necessarily like the evil thing in the room or the elephant in the room that we're not talking about. But we do need to look at it and maybe examine, like, how can we change some of our ideas, at least that whole idea of extraction.
Well, we have to, because capitalism is what we've got. So, it's
That's
fun.
true.
It's all fun and well to go, someday we're going to overthrow capitalism and then everything will be fixed. No.
No, that's true.
You know what I mean?
Yes,
So, yeah,
yes.
you have to, go like fix the room in the burning house or try, That's participation.
Yeah. That's
Well,
great.
I want to talk about the way you two are participating and what you can offer to other people in order for them to participate more. So, Meredith Leigh, you're the author of Pure Charcuterie and the Ethical Meat Handbook. How can people, other than buying your books, what can they do to get involved and learn from you?
Sure. Well, my website's ethicalmeatbook.com, and I have a free ebook downloadable on that site, as well as a page of resources that you can get started for free. And then buy the books, obviously, for a deeper dive. I also co-own the Fermentation School, fermentationschool.com, which is an online education project bringing together women all over the world and students all over the world to learn home fermentation. And I'm out there. I'm out there in the world. Reach out to me. But ethicalmeatbook.com and fermentationschool.com.
And Laura Lengnick, author of Resilient Agriculture, Cultivating Food Systems for a Changing Climate. You also have an organization that people can get involved with find out more about at any rate.
I'm actually right now working as Director of Agriculture for the Glenwood Center for Regional Food and Farming, so folks can certainly find me through that website. But I have my own business called Cultivating Resilience, based here in Asheville, and you can find me at cultivatingresilience.com and just have some fun poking around that website to see the kind of projects that I do locally. I also work around the country, but I've done quite a large amount of work in the region here in Western North Carolina. You can find me there, invite me to a book reading. I really enjoy meeting and having discussions about these ideas just in the way that we've done today. So really appreciate talking with you, Martha, and thanks for inviting Meredith.
Well, thank you both so much for joining me. I think we're going to have to do this again. It's such a huge subject. I think we're going to have to do another couple hours, maybe in the fall. I want to thank you very much, both of you, for your time. My name is Martha Senator. You've been listening to Listen and Be Heard, and you can find the podcast of this show at listenandbeheard.net, along with author interviews. There's videos. We have columns. And I would like to hear from you. I would like to know you're listening. So please send me a note at editor@listenandbeheard.net. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you don't like. We'll be back next week. I'll be joined again by Tony Robles. I want to thank you for listening and allowing me to be heard.